Good morning. One of the two Nigels from CBRE. The other Nigel I've known since I was 5 at prep school. I can't seem to get rid of him, unfortunately. But hopefully, between the two of us, we can give you some information on our view on the market fundamentals. I head up the Global Premier Properties division for CBRE, which is specifically aimed at managing the tall, iconic buildings around the world. At the moment, we have around 235 in the stable, including some of the ones you heard about this morning, Shanghai Tower. We start on the Gherkin next month, hopefully, and also 2 out of the 3 Willis buildings we've managed. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm talking about the market fundamentals. And when I first heard that we were going to be talking about this, I thought London's a rather strange place to be having the conference, because we don't really do tall buildings. As you can see on the lower slide, one building does stand out. Interesting enough, it was a design and build. It was pre-let, had the same tenant since 1710, and was St Paul's, which at the time was 111 metres, which was pretty tall for London at that period, and really has remained tall for London for many centuries. I know there are a number of developers and owners in the room, so the market fundamentals, pretty straightforward, it's the money. But if that was the case, and it was only the money, then we would never build buildings like this. So we build buildings like this with high net to gross, low construction costs. I'm not sure which building that is, and it probably doesn't exist anymore, probably fortunately. But that's what we would have. But that isn't the case, and what we do have is some incredible architecture, things that make cities like London really exciting places to live and work, and they really form part of our heritage. And that's what makes these buildings very special. But for anyone who's done even the first day, the first hour of economics, the fundamentals are pretty straightforward, just it's supply and demand. Now, as we heard earlier from Peter, the planning issue clearly changes that graph dramatically. But those are the basic principles. And the drivers behind that really form on these principles. So we have economic drivers, the availability and cost of capital, rent on completion, the occupier demand, and what the occupier trends are going to be. With the tall buildings, they slightly change, because delivery, as we know, is 4 to 8 years away, even longer for the super tall. The availability of cost of capital, these are expensive and slightly riskier projects, so getting that capital is harder. What is the rent on completion going to be? It's an educated guess based upon many, many assumptions. And the forecasts on occupier demand are also very hard to predict. And when you do have your delivery, then what are they going to want? Have you built what they actually need? Have you built something that the tenants want to and enjoy occupying? So looking now at the tall building delivery, I've taken 5 cities, principal cities, to see when they've actually delivered. And I think we can first of all see that London and Frankfurt really just don't play the tall building game. Hong Kong clearly does. But you can also see the delivery is really volatile. It comes in waves. These are buildings over 100 metres in height and do include residential, which is one of the reasons why Hong Kong has got such a high number. But if we look at then how these buildings are delivered and when they come with some of the world's recessions, I was hoping that we could see some kind of order and we could learn some lessons about when to deliver. So in 73 to 75, we saw New York increasing and Tokyo slowing. 79 to 83, there were some ups and some downs, but no pattern. In 89 to 93, Tokyo was up, New York down. And in 99 to 03, a huge peak in Hong Kong and showing growth after a huge period of recession. So generally, we can see there is a slowing after a recession, but of course it's too late. So we end up stopping the moment the recovery starts. That's, I guess, human nature, and it just proves that we can't predict what the economic future is going to be. But looking now to a few more examples closer to home, 2 buildings I've taken for a number of cities to see if, when we look at the real detail, we can actually see some lessons to learn. So we've got Canary Wharf and the Willis building, which we heard about earlier. The Willis, slightly unusual because it was a design and build, but nonetheless, if we then overlay what happened, we can see that financial employment varied dramatically during the period between planning and completion. Now, the financial employment is very important because these are typically the occupiers of tall buildings, and if it is residential as well, the higher paid office workers tend to be the guys who are the girls who are actually buying and occupying the residential. And in both these buildings, we've seen huge swings in the employment. 25 Bank had a big drop in financial employment, and the Willis had a swing the other way, but after completion, it changed dramatically. For New York, looking at two buildings again, and Madison had growth before and a roller coaster. So the lessons really learned, and I won't go on and on about this, but we can just see that there is no real pattern. Madison, excuse me. So here are the Madison ones. For Tokyo, so Hong Kong, I've looked at IFC and Nina Tower. And on these ones, we can see huge variations again. And Japan, again, we have the same problem. If you're a developer or an owner, deciding when to start and when to finish is a real tricky question. So to put some academic overlay on that, Dr. Kenneth Rosen from the US, he's basically stated what I think we've seen already, that the supply is a function of the employment, and the price that delivers is really relating to how much employment is around at the time. The demand side is of employers in the cities, and GDP growth is important. Companies have to have profits to be able to afford to occupy tall buildings which have expensive rents. And the vacancy rate obviously varies depending on how successful these companies are at the particular time. But moving backwards, the developer is trying to second guess when the right moment to develop is. So we have a developer looking at what expected rents will be, what the construction costs will be, and we've just heard that they can vary dramatically, how interest rates are going to vary during the period of build, and also what the taxes are going to be on completion and during the build. So, in summary, we tend to start periods of construction after a period of economic growth, and at best we build through a volatile period and hope that when we complete, we're in another growth period. But that is obviously not always the case. Economic forecasting is very unpredictable. The financial employment, which drives our occupation, is again unpredictable, and the occupancy rates drive off both. Rental rates are really hard to predict, and that's one of the key economic drivers to the value of the building. And at the end, a bit like buses, we wait for ages for a tall building to arrive, and then a whole lot arrive together, and that makes letting them, which Nigel Smith is going to come on to in a minute, even harder. So, in conclusion, I think all I can say is there's never a right time to start building a tall building. And all I can suggest is you put your best foot forward and build a sustainable, interesting building that adds to our architectural heritage for the future. Thank you very much.
So this section deals with how the workplace is changing the design of buildings and also the built environment. And I suppose the adage of if you can't control the market that you're within, as Nigel Biggs was explaining, then let's look at the things that you can control and use those to deliver a better marketing campaign and make your building more attractive to those occupiers. Well, at the core of these changes to the workplace are really the fact that we now have up to 4 generations living, working in any one particular office, all with various different requirements, whether it's the corner office or whether it's working out of a coffee shop from the ground floor. And really, the adage, anytime, any place, any device, is at the root of these changes. We've carried out research to look at how much time do we spend at the desk. And this is not about working from home, as we were discussing earlier, but this is more about when you come in, sit down, you do real work. And it's interesting that even at the peak times, probably only 70% of the desk space is being used, and on average, it's only 50%. It's even lower if you look at the bottom line on a Friday afternoon. And this has made corporates, the companies, think differently. They've had to think differently. They've had to bring emotion into the workplace to try and increase efficiency of their workforce. And if you think a person working from their desk or wherever can be more efficient, that should have a knock-on effect to their profitability. And if somehow we as designers and owners of buildings can show how your building is more productive for your workforce, then that, I think, is a real result. And how are the employees affecting the changes? Well, they're looking for different things. They're looking for learning. They're looking for collaboration. Cultural ties we heard about this morning from the Willis Group. Flexibility, enjoyment. These are all the changes that people are looking for. And this has affected, obviously, the way that we design the buildings. And as David said, creating these communities within the towers themselves. Sky lobbies, as they're being called in Shanghai Tower. And I think this is a very interesting quotation from the CEO of IBM Global. And he talks about the unending war for talent. And it really is true, especially in Asia, where I live. And they are looking for more ways to be creative and collaborate, teaming, as we heard again this morning. And they want to learn from each other, and I think that is very important. People enjoy working together. And this is really how it looks now. We've seen in Asia, particularly, an increase in the amount of collaboration, recreation, whatever you want to call it, type of space. We ourselves, in our office in Hong Kong, have our canteen right next door to the reception. It's acceptable now. It was a cultural change. It was a cultural shock for us, but it works now. And our clients who come into the office appreciate it. I've heard of climbing walls. I've heard of pool tables. Many different items are being incorporated into the workspace, whether it's at the reception level or actually in the actual office space itself. If you look at it from a corporation's point of view, gone, I think, are the days of the large floor plates. They're less necessary. There's still a use for them in certain industries and trading situations, but perhaps the new big floor plate is the vertical system. Companies are looking at branding themselves vertically within buildings through the use of perhaps staircases, as in the example in this photograph. They can create little communities through coffee breakout areas on each of the floors. They can brand the areas, not just in the reception or in the lift lobby, where sometimes you can and sometimes you can't brand your company, but they're trying to create this inner culture through perhaps a vertical or 3D expansion, and that flexibility coming into the workplace. We talked about many examples in London. I'll talk about 20 Fenchurch Street, the walkie-talkie, as they tell me it's called. And what's interesting here, I think, is two things. First of all, for the employees, which is very much about the Sky Garden at the top, the place that you can break out, sit down, work in different ways and formats. Sit down with one person or many people. You can get outside, you can eat indoors. But perhaps also as important for the companies, from the company's perspective, is the higher density. The 1 person per 8 square meters has been very attractive to the target tenants that they were looking for, which is particularly the insurance sector. And their way of compressing the costs has been by putting more people in. But the building facilities, the core that David was talking about earlier, is absolutely crucial in that, in terms of both the lifting but also the facilities that are within. So how are some of these design trends that are being requested by the occupiers, how have they changed some of the features that we see on the buildings? Well, first of all, let's look at perhaps some of those requirements in more detail. What's interesting is there are 4 key areas from our research that occupiers are looking for when they consider various buildings. Obviously, from a district point of view, you're looking at the labor availability, and often 50–60% of your costs are going to be in the labor force, and that's why the employee is so important and such a focus. Real estate cost is always there, and we've heard about that this morning in terms of the compression, but I'd like to look at the 2 other areas, which is risk, in my mind, whether it's through the environment, the legal employee environment, or is it the risk or the risk mitigation that the building can provide you. It's a bit like an insurance policy. If you can reduce your risk, then you are, in theory, going to become more profitable. But also in terms of the infrastructure and also the industry clusters, it's very interesting how some companies, the insurance, for example, want to be together, and that's important when we start looking at marketing buildings. If you take it down to the next level and you take out, say, cost, lease flexibility, and location, and let's look at the buildings themselves, what are the top 7? Well, profile, design, specifications, experiences, as well as property management. Let me just go into a couple of these by using case studies. First of all, Canary Wharf. We've heard a lot of things about Canary Wharf today, some good, some not so good. But I think for the overall profile, the architecture, the architect is important. The image, the visibility is something that we can't yet quantify in terms of a rental or that profitability I was talking about earlier. But in this particular case, from a design point of view, it was very much about the build to suit. And that's what was attractive to those tenants who could also put names on top of their buildings. In Paris, it's the specifications in terms of natural light, about the levels of CO2 detection, about allowing for windows to be open. These all lead to a better working place for employees. In Hudson Yards in New York, it was very much the experience, not just the arrival and the reception, but the mixed use, the 14 acres, the hotels, the 5,000 homes. Be interesting to know how that works out for them compared with what we heard this morning in London. Obviously, accessibility there in terms of the subway lines. And then just finally, as an example, in terms of sustainability, going to the next level, it is important. The corporates do want certification as a way to mitigate their risk that I talked about earlier. And that makes them feel better and operate better. So how can we market these? Let me give you some pointers. Well, brand ambition is very important when you are marketing, and we heard a lot about brand and business from Carmine this morning. Brand insight, what is unique and distinctive about your building? What do the occupiers want, and how can you tap into that and make a relevant connection? Because really, at the end of the day, that is what your marketing collateral is trying to do. It's trying to connect your building with that occupier or industry. And you've got to press the buttons that they listen to. And it's less about the glossy pictures, but more about some of the words and the detail that you get into. And really, that comes down to perhaps a central thought and then delivery with passion. How do you understand what will actually interest the occupier? It may be location, it may be accessibility. It's normally in that arena. But as I explained earlier, there are other design, specification, facilities, management, environmental issues that are also important, not to mention the actual ownership itself. Making a building different, as in the case of this project in Seoul that we worked on, it was one of the first new mixed-use projects that was targeting financial companies. And would you believe it, in Seoul, whilst they have 3 CBDs, they didn't really have a totally integrated project until this was developed by AIG and the local government. What type of materials are you going to use? Are you going to go just for print, the big glossy brochure? What about digital? And digital does seem to be the way forward, particularly in areas of social networking. But to make social networking work for you in terms of Twitters and hits, you've got to have people wanting to talk about your building. And as they say, whether it's good or bad, gossip creates a brand. It creates noise and what we call general market awareness. How long should it last? In 2IFC, when it was developed in 2003, it was probably the lowest point in Hong Kong's history. You turn that around 10 years going forward, and we're the most expensive real estate in the world as of last year. So sometimes just keeping it simple, if that's all you've got to go with. Trying to be functional about the way you describe it. In this case, we were marketing the central 18 floors of the tower in competition with 4 other owners, trying to lease out a remaining 70 other floors. So sometimes you could be creative about it. In the case of ICC, we worked with a local design firm here in London, actually, and we came up with the adage, I can see, and the whole point here was, I can see it across the water. It's a bit like the Shard from the City of London. In this case, it was opposite the main central business district. So I can see was very, very important and very clear to them. In the case of Taipei 101, they were marketing for 4 years about being the tallest and the biggest and the best, and not necessarily being the tallest is about being the best. And I urge them to try and change the messaging that they have, which is really look at a lifestyle message, which back in 2005 was the new buzzword. Everybody wanted to talk about lifestyle. We've moved on since then, as I've hopefully explained earlier. But also then being able to use, as you can see in the postcard here, the bottom right-hand corner, the icon rather than logos, trying to create something different. And by looking at that, You don't see any negativity, which they were having locally in terms of the height and being on an earthquake zone, would you believe? But they had more of an understanding of how the retail connects with the rest of the building. So just in summary, what I would like to suggest is that really I believe that we've moved on from the original triple bottom line, which we do know as the economy, environmental and social issues that companies need to be aware of. It helps them drive down costs and increases profitability. But I believe that over the last few years, and as recent as this, that developers and occupiers have moved into a different space, and they are trying to balance space with creativity. But today, what I'd like to emphasize through this presentation is very much how now emotion has come into the workplace, and how emotion is driving efficiency and effectiveness from an occupier's point of view in terms of the employees that they are able to attract. And I believe that tall buildings, iconic buildings, are able to attract a different type of employee, which is important to corporates. Thank you.